Picture this. You're trapped inside a castle with 1,000 other people, surrounded by an enemy army that's determined to starve you out, burn you alive, or tear down your walls stone by stone. The siege has been going on for months. Your food supplies are running dangerously low. Disease is spreading through the cramped quarters, and outside, the attackers are building massive wooden towers and digging tunnels beneath your walls, planning to bring your entire world crashing down around you. This was the brutal reality of medieval siege warfare, where entire kingdoms could be won or lost based on whether a single castle could hold out against impossible odds. Welcome to medieval madness. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, sieges were the backbone of medieval warfare. Forget everything you've seen in movies about glorious cavalry charges across open battlefields. The real wars were won and lost at castle walls, where defenders used every trick, trap, and terror tactic imaginable to survive attacks that could last for months or even years. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. Some of these castles didn't just survive these brutal sieges, they thrived. The defenders turned their fortresses into death traps for attackers, using ingenious architectural designs and ruthless tactics that would make modern military strategists weep with envy. Today, we're going to explore the incredible world of medieval castle defense, where survival meant more than just building thick walls. We'll discover the brilliant engineering that made these fortresses nearly impregnable, the psychological warfare that broke the spirits of attacking armies, and the desperate measures defenders took when all conventional weapons failed. By the end of this video, you'll understand why medieval siege warfare was a deadly game of chess, played with human lives, where one wrong move could mean the difference between victory and watching your entire world burn to the ground. And trust me, the stories I'm about to tell you are more brutal and ingenious than anything Hollywood could dream up. But first, let me paint you a picture of what these sieges actually looked like, because the reality was far more terrifying than you might imagine. When an attacking army approached a medieval castle, they weren't just facing a building, they were confronting a military machine designed for one purpose: to kill as many people as possible while keeping the defenders alive. These weren't just homes for nobles, they were fortified death traps that had been perfected over centuries of constant warfare. The siege would begin with the attackers surrounding the castle, cutting off all supply lines and communication with the outside world. This wasn't just about preventing food from getting in. The besiegers would systematically destroy everything outside the castle walls: crops, livestock, villages, anything that could support the defenders. The message was clear: surrender or watch everything you've ever known burn. But the real psychological warfare was just beginning. Attacking armies would often execute prisoners in full view of the castle walls, catapult severed heads over the battlements, or display the bodies of captured defenders to break the morale of those still fighting. When Henry V besieged Rouen in France, he ordered dead animals to be thrown into the castle's wells and had catapults launch manure and corpses over the walls, hoping to spread disease among the enemy. Meanwhile, the defenders knew that surrender often meant death or enslavement. They had no choice but to fight with everything they had, using tactics that were as brilliant as they were brutal. The key to understanding medieval siege warfare is realizing that these weren't just military conflicts, they were battles of engineering and endurance. The attackers had to find a way to breach walls that were sometimes 20 feet thick, while the defenders had to survive for months with limited supplies, all while fighting off constant attacks from enemies who outnumbered them 10 to 1. And here's where the genius of medieval castle design really shines. These fortresses weren't just built to be strong, they were built to be smart. Every single element of their architecture was designed to turn the attackers' own weapons against them, creating killing fields where hundreds of enemies could be slaughtered without the defenders ever leaving the safety of their walls. The most advanced of these fortresses used something called concentric design, which was basically a castle within a castle. Picture this: an attacking army finally manages to breach the outer wall after weeks of fighting. only to discover that they're now trapped in a narrow courtyard, surrounded by an even higher inner wall, with archers raining arrows down on them from every direction. But the real masterpiece of medieval defensive architecture was the gatehouse. This wasn't just a door, it was a fortress within a fortress, packed with so many deadly traps that attacking it was essentially suicide. The gatehouse contained multiple metal portcullis gates, arrow slits positioned to create crossfire, and the infamous murder holes, which were openings in the ceiling through which defenders could pour boiling water, quicklime, or burning oil directly onto attackers' heads. Imagine being a knight in heavy armor, trapped in a narrow corridor with your fellow soldiers, when suddenly scalding liquid starts pouring down from above. You can't see where it's coming from, you can't escape, because there are hundreds of men packed behind you, and your armor, which was supposed to protect you, is now cooking you alive. The defenders had turned their own home into a house of horrors, where every door, every corridor, every staircase was designed to kill intruders in the most efficient way possible. And this was just the beginning. Castle walls themselves were engineering marvels that could withstand attacks that would level modern buildings. The center of these walls was filled with rough rocks and rubble, while the outer sections were made of massive stones, laid like giant bricks. This gave the walls incredible strength against battering rams and catapult stones, but it also allowed defenders to repair damage quickly by simply adding more stones to the core. But here's where medieval engineers really showed their genius. They didn't just build walls to keep people out, they built them to funnel attackers into killing zones. The walls were covered with arrow slits, narrow openings that allowed defenders to shoot at attackers while remaining almost completely protected. A skilled archer could fire dozens of arrows through these slits without ever exposing himself to enemy fire. The towers that jutted out from the walls weren't just for show either. They were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, meaning that any attacker approaching the walls would be shot at from multiple directions simultaneously. Some towers were even equipped with their own trebuchets, allowing defenders to launch massive stones at attacking siege engines. And if attackers somehow managed to get close to the walls, they'd encounter another nasty surprise: machicolations. These were openings in the floor of overhanging sections of the wall, through which defenders could drop rocks, pour boiling liquids, or shoot arrows straight down at anyone trying to climb scaling ladders. The medieval castle wasn't just a fortress, it was a weapon. Every stone, every opening, every architectural feature was designed to kill attackers as efficiently as possible. And the people defending these castles were just as ingenious as the buildings themselves. But walls and towers were just the beginning. The real genius of medieval castle defense lay in the tactics the defenders used to turn their fortress into an impenetrable death trap. These weren't just soldiers hiding behind walls, they were strategic masterminds who understood that survival meant being more clever, more ruthless, and more desperate than their enemies. And as we'll discover, some of these defensive tactics were so effective that they changed the course of history, allowing small groups of defenders to hold out against massive armies for months or even years. The stories of these sieges read like the most intense thriller novels you've ever encountered, except every word is true. When conventional weapons ran out, medieval defenders became absolutely ruthless, using whatever they could hurl down on attackers. Burning oil, flaming logs, spikes and rocks became their ammunition of choice. But here's what most people don't realize. The defenders had to get creative with their projectiles. They'd heat sand until it was scalding hot and pour it through the gaps in attackers' armor, where it would burn their skin and drive them mad with pain. Quicklime was another favorite weapon, creating chemical burns that could blind and disfigure attackers permanently. The defenders also mastered the art of the counterattack. Using sally ports, which were hidden doors in the castle walls, small groups of defenders would burst out at night to attack the besiegers' camps. These raids weren't just about causing damage. They were psychological warfare designed to keep the attacking army on edge, never knowing when death might come charging out of the darkness. But perhaps the most ingenious defensive tactic was countermining. When attackers tried to dig tunnels under the castle walls to collapse them, the defenders would dig their own tunnels to intercept them. Picture this. You're a miner working in complete darkness, slowly digging toward the castle foundation, when suddenly you break through into another tunnel and find yourself face to face with enemy soldiers wielding swords and axes. These underground battles were some of the most terrifying encounters in medieval warfare, fought in cramped spaces where there was no room to run. The defenders also used sound as a weapon. They would place bowls of water on the ground to detect vibrations from enemy tunneling operations. When they heard the telltale sounds of digging, they'd know exactly where to start their counter-mining operations. Some defenders even kept geese, because these birds were incredibly sensitive to underground vibrations and would start honking frantically when enemies were digging nearby. Water was another crucial element of castle defense. Most castles were built with deep wells that could provide fresh water for months, but smart defenders also used water as a weapon. They would flood their own tunnels when attackers tried to mine under the walls, drowning the enemy miners in the process. Some castles even had elaborate water systems that could flood entire sections of the fortress if they were about to be overrun. The psychological pressure on both sides during these sieges was absolutely crushing. Defenders knew that if the castle fell, they would likely be executed or enslaved. Attackers knew that every day the siege continued. Their own supplies dwindled and their risk of disease increased. This created a deadly game of endurance, where both sides were fighting not just each other, but time itself. Disease was often the ultimate decider in medieval sieges. The cramped conditions inside castles created perfect breeding grounds for illness. But the attacking armies camped outside weren't much better off. Dysentery, plague, and other diseases could spread through either side, turning a military siege into a battle against invisible enemies that killed more people than any sword or arrow. The longest siege in English history perfectly illustrates just how brutal these conflicts could become. Kenilworth Castle was under constant attack for 172 days in 1266, with over 1,000 defenders holding out against the entire feudal host of England. The royal forces tried everything: massive trebuchets, wooden siege towers, and every conventional weapon available. But the castle's unique defenses, including an artificial lake that protected the south and west sides, made it nearly impossible to attack. In the end, it wasn't military might that brought down Kenilworth. It was starvation and disease. After nearly 6 months of siege, the defenders had only 2 days' worth of food left, and dysentery had weakened the garrison so severely that they could barely fight. They surrendered not because their walls had been breached, but because they were slowly dying inside their own fortress. The siege of Carcassonne in 1209 shows how even the most formidable defenses could fall to sustained pressure. This fortress had double rampart walls spanning nearly 3 kilometers, with 52 towers creating layered defenses that should have been impregnable. But after 15 days of siege, the defenders surrendered because their water and food supplies had been cut off. The attackers didn't need to breach the walls, they just needed to wait for the people inside to slowly starve. These sieges changed the entire nature of medieval warfare. Battles that once lasted hours now stretched into months. Entire kingdoms could be bankrupted by the cost of maintaining a siege, and the psychological toll on both sides was devastating. Families were separated, crops were destroyed, and entire regions could be depopulated by the constant threat of siege warfare. But here's what makes these medieval defenders truly remarkable. They refused to give up. Even when facing impossible odds, even when disease was spreading through their ranks, even when their food supplies were gone, they continued fighting. They understood that surrender meant death, so they chose to fight until their last breath. The legacy of medieval siege warfare lives on in every castle ruin you see today. Those crumbling walls and broken towers are testament to the incredible ingenuity, brutality, and determination of people who refused to be conquered. They turned their homes into weapons, their families into soldiers, and their very lives into the ultimate defensive strategy. Medieval siege warfare wasn't just about military tactics. It was about human endurance pushed to its absolute limits. It was about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when faced with impossible circumstances. And it was about the kind of determination that could hold back entire armies with nothing more than stone walls, clever engineering, and the absolute refusal to surrender. So the next time you see a medieval castle, remember that you're not just looking at a building, you're looking at a monument to human ingenuity and survival, where desperate people created defensive masterpieces that could withstand months of brutal attacks. These weren't just fortresses, they were symbols of defiance against impossible odds. Thank you for joining me on this journey through medieval madness. If you enjoyed diving into the brutal reality of medieval siege warfare, make sure to subscribe because we've got plenty more dark chapters of history waiting to be explored. Until next time, stay curious about the past, and remember that sometimes the most incredible stories are the ones that actually happened.